Welcome to Brainish English Stories.
The first thing I did was to look at the clock as I entered the waiting room of the station at Loubain. And I found that I had to wait 2 hours and 10 minutes for the Paris Express. I had walked 20 miles and felt suddenly tired. Not seeing anything on the station walls to amuse me, I went outside and stood there thinking of something to do. The street was planted with trees, and on either side of road were houses of varying shapes and different styles of architecture. At the end of the street was a park. From time to time a cat crossed the street and jumped over the gutters carefully. A dog sniffed at every tree and hunted for scraps from the kitchens, but I did not see a single human being, and I felt restless and disheartened. What could I do with myself? I was already thinking of visiting a small cafe at the railway station, where I should have to sit over a glass of undrinkable beer and the illegible newspaper. Then I saw a funeral procession coming out of a side street into the one in which I was, and the sight of the hearse was a relief to me. It would, at any rate, give me something to do for 10 minutes. Suddenly, however, my curiosity was aroused. The hearse was followed by 8 gentlemen, one of whom was weeping, while the others were chatting together, but there was no priest, and I thought to myself, "This is a non-religious funeral," and I thought. But why this was a non-religious funeral? The rapid pace of the procession clearly proved that the body was to be buried without ceremony, and, consequently, without the intervention of the church. I was so curious that I decided to follow it, with the 8 gentlemen. That would take up my time for an hour, at least, and I accordingly walked with the others, with a sad look on my face. Seeing me walking with the procession, the 2 last men turned round in surprise, and then spoke to each other in a low voice. No doubt they were asking each other whether I belonged to the town, and then they told the 2 in front of them, who stared at me in turn. This curiosity annoyed me, and to put an end to it I went up to them, and, after bowing, I said, "I beg your pardon, gentlemen, for interrupting your conversation, but, seeing a civil funeral, I have followed it, although I did not know the deceased gentleman whom you are accompanying." "It was a woman," one of them said. I was much surprised at hearing this, and asked, "But it is a civil funeral, is it not?" The other gentleman, who evidently wished to tell me all about it, then said, "Yes and no. The clergy have refused to allow us the use of the church." On hearing this I said shockingly, "Ah," in astonishment. I could not understand it at all, but the man near me continued, "It is rather a long story. This young woman committed suicide, and that is the reason why she cannot be buried with any religious ceremony. The gentleman who was walking first, and who was crying, is her husband." I replied with some hesitation, "You surprise and interest me very much, sir. Shall I be careful, if I ask you to tell me the facts of the case? If I am troubling you, forget that I have said anything about the matter." The gentleman took my arm familiarly. "Not at all, not at all. Let us linger a little behind the others, and I will tell it you, although it is a very sad story. We have plenty of time before getting to the cemetery." And he began. This young woman, Madame Paul Hammett, was the daughter of a wealthy merchant in the neighborhood, Monsieur Fontenelle. When she was a mere child of 11, she had a shocking adventure. A footman attacked her and she nearly died. A terrible criminal case was the result, and the man was sentenced to death. The little girl grew up and was disgraced, isolated, without any companions. The grown-ups scarcely kissed her and loved her. People said to each other in a whisper, "You know, little Fontenelle," and everybody ran away in the streets when she passed. Her parents could not even get a nurse to take her out for a walk. The other servants of the house also stayed away from her, as if contact with her would poison everybody who came near her. It was pitiable to see the poor child go and play every afternoon. She remained quite by herself, standing by her maid and looking at the other children amusing themselves. Sometimes, she desired to mix with the other children to play with them. She walked very timidly, with nervous gestures, and tried to mingle with a group. She was so afraid, as if conscious of her own disgrace. And immediately the mothers, aunts, and nurses would come running from every seat and take their children by the hand and drag them brutally away. Little Fontenelle remained alone and sad, without understanding what it meant, and then she began to cry, nearly heartbroken with grief. And then she used to run and hide her head in her nurse's lap, sobbing. As she grew up, it was worse still. They kept the girls from her, as if she were stricken with the plague. When she went through the streets, she was always accompanied by her maid. Even her parents feared that something terrible would happen. The other girls, who were not nearly so innocent as people thought, whispered and giggled as they looked at her knowingly, and immediately turned their heads away, if she happened to look at them. People scarcely greeted her, only a few men bowed to her, and the mothers pretended not to see her, while some young blackguards called her Madame Baptiste, after the name of the footman who had attacked her. Nobody knew the secret torture of her mind, for she hardly ever spoke and never laughed. And her parents themselves appeared uncomfortable in her presence, as if she was a burden to them. Even in the presence of her parents she felt alone and disgraced. And Monsieur and Madame Fontenelle looked at their daughter as if she was just released from the prison. She was pretty and pale, tall, slender, distinguished-looking, and she would have pleased me very much, monsieur, but for that unfortunate affair. Well, when a new sub-prefect, French officer, was appointed here, 18 months ago, he brought his private secretary with him. He was a strange man, who had lived in the Latin Quarter. He saw Madame Fontenelle and fell in love with her, and when told of what occurred, he merely said, "Bah! I don't care what happened in the past. I love her and respect her. I shall live a peaceful life with that woman." He made a respectful approach to her, asked for her hand and married her. Some people returned them, others did not, but, at last, the affair began to be forgotten, and she took her proper place in society. She adored her husband as if he had been a god, for, you must remember, he had restored her to honor and to social life, had braved public opinion, faced insults, and, in a word, performed such a courageous act as few men would undertake, and she felt the most powerful and tender love for him. When she became pregnant, and it was known, most of the town people opened their doors to her, as if she had been definitely purified by maternity. It is strange, but so it is, and thus everything was going on as well as possible until the other day, which was the feast of the patron saint of our town. The officer, surrounded by his staff and the authorities, presided at the musical competition, and when he had finished his speech the distribution of medals began, which Paul Hammett, his private secretary, handed to those who were entitled to them. As you know, there are always jealous people who like to create a scene. All the ladies of the town were there on the platform, and, in his turn, the bandmaster from the village of Moormillen came up. This band was only to receive a second-class medal, for one cannot give first-class medals to everybody, can one? But when the private secretary handed him his badge, the man threw it in his face. He was angry and wanted to insult the officer and his wife, Madame Fontenelle. The man exclaimed angrily, "You may keep your medal for Baptiste. You owe him a first-class one, also, just as you do me." There were a number of people there who began to laugh. Every men and women turned their eyes toward that poor lady. Have you ever seen a woman going mad, monsieur? Well, we were present at the sight. She got up and fell back on her chair 3 times in succession, as if she wished to make her escape, but saw that she could not make her way through the crowd, and then another voice in the crowd exclaimed, "Oh! Oh! Madame Baptiste!" And a great noise, partly of laughter and partly of unfair anger, arose. The word was repeated over and over again. People stood on tiptoe to see the unhappy woman's face. Husbands lifted their wives up in their arms, so that they might see her, and people asked, "Which one is she? The one in blue?" The boys gathered like cocks, and laughter was heard all over the place. She did not move now on her state chair, but sat just as if she had been put there for the crowd to look at. She could not move, nor conceal herself, nor hide her face. Her eyelids blinked quickly, as if a vivid light were shining on them. And she breathed heavily, as if she had ran a lot. Meanwhile, however, Monsieur Hammett had seized the bandman who was the troublemaker by the throat. And they were rolling on the ground together fighting. An hour later, as the Hammets were returning home, the young woman, who had not uttered a word since the insult, but who was trembling with fear, suddenly sprang over the wall of the bridge and threw herself into the river before her husband could prevent her. The water is very deep under the arches, and it was 2 hours before her body was recovered. Of course, she was dead. The narrator stopped and then added, "It was, perhaps, the best thing she could do under the circumstances. There are some things which cannot be wiped out, and now you understand why the clergy refused to have her taken into church." Ah! If it had been a religious funeral the whole town would have been present, but you can understand that her suicide added to the other affair and made families abstain from attending her funeral. And then, it is not an easy matter here to attend a funeral which is performed without religious rites. We passed through the cemetery gates and I waited, much moved by what I had heard, until the coffin had been lowered into the grave, before I went up to the poor fellow who was sobbing violently, to press his hand warmly. He looked at me in surprise through his tears and then said, "Thank you, monsieur." And I was not sorry that I had followed the funeral.